Welcome to Shahnameh, Book of Kings. Today we begin a new chapter, the Death of Rostam. Zal had a female slave who was a musician and storyteller. She gave birth to a son whose beauty eclipsed the moon in appearance. He resembled Sam, and the whole family rejoiced in his birth. Astrologers and wise men from Zabol and Kashmir came with their astronomical charts to cast the boy's horoscope and to see whether the heavens would smile on him. But when they had done so, they looked at another in alarm and dismay and said to Zal, "You and your family have been favored by the stars, and when we searched the secrets of the heavens, we saw that this boy's fortune is not an auspicious one. When this handsome lad reached manhood and became a warrior, he will destroy the seed of Sam and Nariman. He will break your family's power. Because of him, Sistan will be filled with lamentation, and the land of Iran will be thrown into confusion. He will bring bitter days to everyone, and few enough of you will survive his onslaught." Zal was saddened by these words, and turned to God in his anxiety. "Lord of the heavens, my refuge and support, my guide in all actions, creator of the heavens and the stars, may we hope to find good fortune, and may nothing but goodness and peace come to us." Then he named the boy Shaghad. His mother kept him by her until he was weaned, and he was a talkative, charming, and quick-witted child. When his strength had begun to develop, Zal sent him to the king of Kabol. There he grew into a fine young man, cypress-statured, a good horseman, and skillful with mace and lariat. The king of Zabol looked on him with favor and considered him worthy of the throne. He bestowed his own daughter on him in marriage and provided her with a splendid dowry. Shaghad was the apple of his eye, and he thought nothing of the stars and the astrologers' predictions. The chieftains of Persia and India told Rostam that every year the kingdom of Kabul was required to hand over as tribute the hide of a cow. But the king of Kabul was sure that now his son-in-law was Rostam's brother, no one would be concerned about a cowskin worth only a few coins. But when time came for the tribute to be paid, it was demanded, and the people of Kabul took offense at this. Shaghad was disgusted by his brother's behavior, but he told no one except the king, to whom he said in secret, "I am tired of the world's ways. My brother treats me with disrespect, but he has no time for me. He's more like a stranger to me than an older brother, more like a fool than a wise man. You and I should work together to entrap him, and this will win us fame in this world." The two confabulated together, and in their own eyes they overtopped the moon, but listened to what the wise have to say. Whoever does evil will be repaid in kind. All night, until the sun rose above the mountains, the two evaded sleep, plotting how to wipe Rostam's name from the world and make Zal's eyes wet with tears of grief. Zaghad said to the king, "If we're going to turn our words into actions, I suggest you give a banquet with wine and musicians and entertainers, and invite our chieftains. Whilst we're drinking wine in front of all the courtiers and guests, speak coldly and slightly to me. Then I'll go to my brother and to my father and curse the lord of Kabul for a low-born wretch, and complain about how he has mistreated me. Meanwhile, you should go to the plain where we hunt and have pits dug there. Make them deep enough to swallow up both Rostam and Raksh, and in the base of the pits plant sharpened stakes, spears, javelins, swords, and so on. And if you dig 100 pits rather than just 5, so much the better. Get 100 men together, dig the pits, and don't breathe a word even to the wind. Then cover over the pit's surface and see that you mention what you've done to no one at all." The king's good sense deserted him, and he gave orders for a banquet to be prepared, as this fool had suggested to him. He summoned the chieftains of the kingdom to a splendid feast, and when they had eaten, they settled to their wine, watching entertainers and listening to musicians. When his head was well filled with royal wine, Shaghad suddenly sprang up and bragged to the king, "I am the first in any company. What noble chieftain compare with me? Rostam's my brother, Zal's my father. Can such a boast be made by any other man?" Then the king, too, sprang up and retorted, "This is your constant boast, but it's not true. The tribe of Sam has turned its back on you. Rostam is not your brother. When has he so much as mentioned your base name to me? You're a slave's son, not Zal's, and Rostam's mother has never said that you that hero's brother." Shaghad was infuriated with his words, and with a few Kaboli warriors he immediately set out for Zabol, revolving thoughts of vengeance in his heart. He entered his noble father's court in a rage, and when Zal saw his son's stature and splendor, he made much of him, questioned him closely, and sent him to Rostam. Rostam was delighted to see him, thinking of him as a wise and pure-hearted man, and greeted him warmly. "Sam is a lion, and his progeny produce only strong, courageous warriors. How is your life now in Kabul, and what do they say about Rostam?" Shaghad's answer was only, "Don't mention the king of Kabul to me. He treated me as well before, addressing me with respect. But now as soon as he drinks a little wine, he becomes quarrelsome, thinking he's superior to everyone else. He humiliated me in front of his courtiers and talked publicly about my low origins. Then he said, 'How long do we have to pay this tribute? Don't we have the strength to defy Sistan? Don't tell me. But it's Rostam you're dealing with. He's no more of a man than I am, and no more nobly born either. Then he said that I wasn't Zal's son, or that, if I was, Zal didn't care about me. I was ashamed to be spoken to like this in front of his chieftains, and when I left Kabul, my cheeks were pale with fury.' Rostam was enraged and said, 'Such talk won't stay private for long. Don't bother yourself with his army. My curse is on his army and on his crown too. I'll destroy him for those words of his. I'll make him and his whole tribe tremble for what he said. I'll place you on his throne, and I'll drag his luck down into the dust.' He entertained Shaghad royally for a few days, putting a splendid residence at his disposal. Then he picked his best warriors and ordered them to get ready to travel to Kabul. When the preparations for departure had been made, Shaghad came to Rostam and said, 'Don't think of going to war against the king of Kabul. I'd only have to trace the letters of your name in water for everyone in Kabul to be sleepless with anxiety. Who would dare stand against you in a war? And if you set out, who is going to wait for you to confront them? I think that by now the king must regret what he's done, that he's searching for some way to neutralize the effect of my departure, and that he'll send some of his chieftains here to apologize.' Rostam replied, 'Here's what we should do. There's no need for me to lead my army against Kabul. Zavoreh and about 100 horsemen together with 100 infantry should be sufficient.' As soon as the malignant Shaghad had left Kabul, the king hurried off to the hunting grounds. He took sappers renowned for their ability with his army, and had them excavate pits at various places on the road, then led them through the area. At the bottom of each pit, javelins, spears, sharp swords were stuck into the ground. Then the pits were covered over with straw and brush, so that neither man nor their mounts could see them. When Rostam was ready to set out, Shaghad rode on ahead of him and told the king of Kabul that Rostam and his men were approaching, and that the king should go to meet them and apologize for what he had done. The king came out of the city, his tongue ready with glazing talk, his heart filled with poison and the longing for vengeance. As soon as he saw Rostam, he dismounted. He removed his Indian turban and placed his hands on his forehead. Then he removed his boots and began to weep, and bowed his face down to the ground, asking pardon for what he had done to Shaghad, saying that if he had spoken intemperately, it was because he was drunk, and that Rostam should forgive him. He came forward, barefooted, but his mind was filled with vengeance. Rostam forgave him, awarding him new honors, and told him to replace his turban and boots and to remount his horse. There was a green, delightful garden in Kabul, filled with streams and trees. Seats were set there, and the king ordered that a banquet be brought. Then he called for wine and musicians to entertain his chieftains and courtiers. While the festivities were in progress, he turned to Rostam and said, "What would you say to a hunting expedition? I have a place near here which includes both open country and mountain landscape, and it's filled with game. There are mountains, sheep, deer, wild asses. A man with a good horse can run down any number of prey. It's a pleasure no one should miss." His description of the landscape with its streams and wild asses filled Rostam with enthusiasm. For when a man's days reach their end, his mind and heart grow undiscerning, dim and blind. The world has no desire that we should see the hidden secrets of our destiny. The crocodile, the lion, the elephant are one with the mosquito and the ant, within the grip of death. No beast or man lives longer tighten his life's allotted span. Rostam gave orders that Raksh be saddled and that hunting hawks be made ready. He took up his bow and rode out on the plain with Shaghad, and Zabol and a few of their retinue accompanied them. The group dispersed, some going toward solid ground, others to where the earth had been excavated. As fate would have it, Zabol and Rostam went to the area where the pits had been dug. But Raksh, he smelt freshly dug dirt. His muscles tensed, and he reared up in fright, his hooves pawing at the ground. He went forward, placing his hooves with care, until he was between two of the pits. Rostam was irritated by his caution, and fate blinded the hero's wisdom. He lightly touched Rask with his whip, and the horse bounded forward, searching for firm ground. But his forelegs struck where one of the pits had been dug, and there was nowhere for him to find a hold. The base of the pit was lined with spears and sharp swords. Courage was of no avail, and there was no mean of escape. Raksh's flanks were lacerated by the weapons, and Rostam's legs and trunk were pierced by them. Exerting all his strength, he pulled himself from their points and raised his head above the pit's edge. When in his agony he opened his eyes, he saw the malignant face of Shaghad before him. He knew then that Shaghad had tricked him, and that this evil was of his doing. He said, "Ill-fated wretch, what have you done? Will leave our land a desert where men curse and grieve. You will regret your evil, senseless rage. Tormented, you will never see old age." Shaghad replied, "The turning heavens have dealt justly with you. How often have you boasted of the blood you've spilt? Excuse me. The blood you've spilt, of your deviation and devastation of Iran, and of your battles. You won't be demanding tribute from Kabul any more, and no king will tremble before you now. Your days are at an end, and you shall perish in the snare of Ahriman." At that moment, the king of Kabul reached them. He saw Rostam's open, bleeding wounds and said, "My lord, what has happened to you here in our hunting grounds? I shall hurry to bring doctors to heal your wounds and to dry my tears of sympathy for your suffering." Rostam replied, "Devious and low-born wretch, the days when doctors could help me are over, and you need weep no tears for me. You too will not live long. No one passes to the heavens while still alive. I possess no more glory than Jamshed, who was hacked in two by Zahak, and Goru slit Siavash's throat when his time had come. All the great kings of Iran, all those who were lions in battle, have departed, and we are left here like lions at the wayside. My son, Faramoths, will demand vengeance from you for my death." Then he turned to Shaghad and said, "Now that this evil has come to me, take my bow from its case. Don't refuse me this last request. String my bow and put it in front of me, together with 2 arrows. A lion may come looking for prey, and if he sees me helpless here, it will attack me. My bow will defend me then, and if no lion tears my flesh, my body will lie beneath the earth soon enough. Shaghad came forward and took out the bow. He strung it, pulled back the string to test it. Then he laughed and placed it in front of Rostam, filled with joy at the thought of his brother's death. With a mighty effort, Rostam picked up the bow and notched an arrow to the string. His brother was filled with fear at the sight of the arrow, and to shield himself, he went behind a huge ancient plane tree, the trunk of which was hollow, although it bore leaves. Rostam watched him go, and then summoning the last strength, he drew back the bowstring and released the arrow. The shaft pierced the tree and his brother, pinning them to one another, and the dying Rostam's heart rejoiced to see this. Shaghad cried out with the pain of his wound, but Rostam soon put him out of his misery. Then he said, "Thanks be to God, to whom for all days I've offered worship and unceasing praise, that now, as night comes on with my last breath, vengeance and power are mine before my death." With these words, his soul left his body, and those who stood nearby lamented and wept. In another pit, Zabol too died, as did those who had ridden with Rostam, both his chieftains and their followers. But one of his retinues survived, and sometimes riding, sometimes on foot, made his way back to Zabol, where he said, "Our mammoth warrior is made one with the dust. Zabol too, and all their men are dead, and only I have escaped from the evil that befell them." The noise of mourning was heard throughout Zabol, and against Shaghad and the king of Kabol, Zal strewed his body with dust and clawed at his face and chest in his grief. Then, in his agony, he cried out, "All I can bring you, Rostam, is your shroud, and Zabol, that lion chief in war, that dragon in close combat, is no more. My curses on Shaghad, whose treachery has ripped up by the roots our royal tree. Who could have thought a cunning fox could leave our mammoth heroes dead and me to grieve? Why could I have not died before them? Why should I endure the world whilst they must die? What's life to me that I should breathe and live? What comfort can my throne or glory give?" And he wept bitterly, lamenting Rostam's departed greatness, his lying courage and bravery, his chivalry and good counsel, his mighty weapons and valor and war, all were gone now that he was one with the earth. Then Zal cursed his son's enemies and summoned Pharamoths. He sent him to make war on the king of Kabol, to retrieve the dead bodies from the pits, and to give the world their cause for lamentation. But when Pharamoths reached Zabol, he found none of the nobility there. They had all fled from the town, weeping and terrified by the world conqueror's death. He made his way to the hunting grounds where the pits had been dug, and when he saw his father's face and his body lying on the ground, soaked in blood, he roared like a lion in pain. He said, "Great warrior, who has done this evil to you? My curse is on his boldness, and may dust cover his head in a place of his crown. I swear by God and by your soul, by the dust of Neriman and Sam, that I shall not remove my armor until I have wreaked revenge upon this treacherous people for your death. I shall not leave one of them who were any part of this plot alive." He removed his father's armor and the clothes beneath it, and gently washed the blood from his body and beard. The company burnt ambergris and saffron, and with it sealed his wounds. Pharamoths poured rosewater on his father's brow, and smeared camphor over the body. Then he wrapped him in brocade, over which they sprinkled rosewater, musk, and wine. 2 great boards were necessary to carry his corpse, which seemed more like a trunk of a huge shade-giving tree than the body of a man. A magnificent coffin was made of teak, with the design inlaid in ivory, and the nails were of gold. The joints were sealed with pitch that had been mixed with musk and ambergris. Then Raksh's body was drawn up from the pit and washed, and draped in fine brocade. Carpenters spent 2 days making a litter from heavy boards for the body, and this was loaded onto an elephant. From Kabul to Zabol, the land was filled with lamentations. Men and women stood crowded on the wayside to see the procession, and the crowds passed the coffins of Rostam and Zavoreh from hand to hand. So great was the number who did this that the burden seemed light as air. The journey took 10 days and 10 nights, and not once were the coffins set down. The world was filled with mourning for Rostam, and the plain seemed to seethe with sorrow. So great was the noise that no individual voice could be heard within the roar of sound. In a garden, they built a great tomb whose roof reached to the clouds. Within 2 golden daïses were built, on which were laid the dead heroes, free men, and the slaves came together and poured rosewater mixed with musk over the heroes' feet, and addressed Rostam. Why is it grief and musk that we must bring, and not the glory that attends a king? You have no need for sovereignty, no need for armor, weapons, or your warlike steed. Never again will your largesse reward courtiers with gifts from your rich treasury hoard. Justice was yours, and truth, and chivalry. May joy be yours for all eternity. Then they sealed the tomb, went on their way, and so ended the lion hero who had lifted up his head in the world with such pride and valor. And here now I end my tale for today, but I'll be back tomorrow with more tales, many more tales. Until then, my friends,